They give ammunition to America's enemies and pause to America's friends. They encourage people of goodwill to remain silent in the face of evil. Our efforts have been crafted carefully to avoid infringing on constitutional rights while saving American lives. Some of our critics, I regret to say, have shown less affection for detail. Their bold declaration of so-called facts have quickly dissolved upon inspection into vague conjecture. Charges of kangaroo courts and shredding the Constitution give new meaning to the term fog of war.
Again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. I know it's a lot to absorb, but just stay with us. And remember, check out every piece of evidence we're bringing forward. And when you find out all of this is true in triplicate, it's voluminous, then you'll be forced to take action. And we've got some solutions to fight this New World Order coming up at the end of the film. Let's go ahead and go into this large folder of government prior knowledge. This is only a small selection of the news stories that we have to prove this at Infowars.com. Here's CNN. U.S. warned in 95 of plot to hijack planes, attack buildings. Actual news article. U.S. warned in 95 of plot to hijack planes and attack buildings. And this article goes into great detail about how the FBI in 95 had actually intercepted terrorists and knew of their plans to hijack aircraft and crash them in to lower Manhattan. Just establishing that the government doesn't need any more funding, doesn't need any more control over our lives. They knew all about this. But you see, they don't get more funding until more terrorist attacks take place. Here's one from the Los Angeles Times, December 5th, 2001. Clinton let bin Laden slip away and metastasize. Sudan offered up the terrorist and data on his network inside the United States. The then president and his advisors didn't respond. See, they're all members of the Council on Foreign Relations. They're all members of the Trilateral Commission. They're all members of the Bilderberg Group. And I know you've been told on the news that those organizations don't exist. We'll play you the Council on Foreign Relations on national television a little bit later in this expose, saying that the terrorist attack is empowering world government. We'll let that come out of the mouth of former Senator Gary Hart at a CFR meeting on national television.
Again, we didn't, unlike what we've said today, we didn't just emphasize the negative, the dangers. We emphasized the opportunities. And Americans are brilliant at many things, not least of which is turning lemons into lemonade. There is a chance for the President of the United States to use this disaster to carry out what his father, a phrase his father used, I think, only once, and hasn't been used since, and that is a new world order. Think about this.
Again, just check out the evidence for yourself. Here it is. Clinton let bin Laden slip away and metastasize. Sudan offered to arrest him and tried to give him data on the network here in the U.S., and Clinton didn't want it. That was in 96 and then again in 98. How did Clinton respond to them? He bombed their aspirin factory, their medical factory that was supplying about a third of Africa with medicines. Now we're getting into the really hardcore evidence. And are you going to wake up out there, people? Or are you just going to be a face in the crowd that doesn't affect change, that doesn't have power? God created you to affect change, to be involved, to be a factor, to be in that arena, not to be a spectator. This is from the Times of London, one of the most highly respected newspapers in England. Wednesday, March 7th, 2001, before September 11th. See, we were already covering this on my radio show. We were saying bin Laden was about to attack and that Bush was funding him and that they were going to then declare martial law, which they've done. CIA worked in tandem with Pakistan to create the Taliban. And that was from March 7th, the Sunday Times of London. And it talks about the Central Intelligence Agency and the CIA worked with Pakistani intelligence, which they put into power, to fund Al-Qaeda and to fund the Taliban, with hundreds of millions of dollars a year, 132 million in 2001 alone. And of course, the head of Pakistani intelligence, which is publicly has to be approved by U.S. funding to that country by the CIA, wired $100,000 to Muhammad Atta, the lead hijacker. All here in the Sunday Times of London. CIA worked in tandem with Pakistan to create the Taliban. And we hear about how the Taliban tortures people, how they kill people, how they deal drugs, which is all true, how they're evil, which is obviously true, how they're oppressive. And our government, the cabal that runs it, put them into power. Put them into power. So that later they could bring them down and the Afghan people would accept anybody over the Taliban, the worst regime in their history, worse than the Russians. And guess who that is now? The United Nations just publicly took it over, the biggest opium production area in the world, and they're out planting their fields. It's in the news. The UN's letting them plant their heroin. And, of course, it has the second biggest oil reserves in the world, and Dick Cheney, the vice president's company, Halliburton, just completed the pipeline 2 months before September 11th into Afghanistan. And now the UN and all these big private banks get all the natural resources. You see how the scam works. Set up a boogeyman, let him attack your country, bring the boogeyman down. Now let's talk about bin Laden being involved in the CIA. I mean, he was like a hero on the news back in the 80s, but now they want you to forget about that. This is MSNBC, though, and this is from August 24th, 1998. Bin Laden comes home to roost. His CIA ties are only the beginning of a woeful story. And it talks about how the CIA funded and created this individual who vacations with the Bush family. There you have it. MSNBC, Bin Laden comes home to roost. His CIA ties are only the beginning of a woeful story. Here's one. This is from the San Francisco Chronicle. Al-Qaeda terrorist worked with the FBI right through the 98 embassy bombings of U.S. embassies. And they never even arrested him. And they let him become a U.S. Army sergeant who then went to train Osama bin Laden's bodyguards. Oh, Al-Qaeda terrorist worked with the FBI. Read all the details at Infowars.com. Here's another article out of the Herald Tribune. In 96, Sudan offered to arrest bin Laden and turn over all files of Al-Qaeda preparing terrorist attacks in the U.S. Bill Clinton refused to even take the files or take bin Laden if they would arrest him. Herald Tribune. Here's another one. Taliban. Oh, this is the Taliban this time. Agreed to hand over Osama bin Laden after the 98 embassy bombings. And this is from the London Guardian. Taliban agreed to hand over Osama bin Laden in 1998, and nothing was done. So it's not just the Sudanese, now it's the Afghans going, hey, blew up your buildings, you fund us, hundreds of millions, we'll arrest him for you. Oh, no, that'll be all right. That doesn't need to happen, Taliban. Bin Laden works for us. And as if the government didn't have prior knowledge, this is Arts Shavaz, and it was also on Fox News later, a big Israeli newspaper, about how there was a full-color 2001 calendar circulating months and months and months before September 11th, where it showed a jumbo jet crashing into the New York skyline, into the World Trade Center towers. And you'll need to go to the website to read the story because the print's kind of small there, but there you can see it. Gets into all that. Here's one from the Times of India. It's an actual reprint out of the BBC. FBI knew of suspects prior to attacks. It talks about how they were training at U.S. military bases and how they were training at private flight schools, and low-level FBI agents tried to do their job and arrest the terrorists and were threatened with being arrested. Again, that's a reprint in the Times of India from the BBC. Here's one from the Los Angeles Times. Watch list didn't get to the airline. Security, federal authorities were suspicious of 2 hijackers, but warning wasn't shared. You read deeper into the article, they'll put you in the watch list if you've been busted with a pound of marijuana before. These guys were known members of Al-Qaeda terrorist network, but the feds, it says, were ordered to keep their names out of the customs computers and the airline computers. So, watch list didn't get to the airline. Oh, but the warning wasn't shared. Though David Shippers, the impeachment lawyer, the guy that brought down the mob in Chicago, was beating on Ashcroft's door, begging him to stop the terrorists with 3 boxes of files, saying to him, they're about to attack any time. We've got to stop them. We've got to stop them now. Why are you threatening these good FBI agents? Why are you threatening defense intelligence officers from the Department of Defense if they stop these terrorists? And Ashcroft, who he